I literally would walk up to people in the street of New York and say, I know an actor who looks like you. If you give me an hour of your time, I'll invite you to see yourself perform.
You're watching It's Been a Minute from NPR. I'm Brittany Luse. My guest today, I've been a fan of hers for nearly half my life. Deavere Smith is an actress, journalist, and playwright. Many of you may have seen her as Rainbow's mom on Blackish, or Nancy from The West Wing.
Nancy?
Leo, Yeoman Fitzwallace.
Dr. McNally?
Let's attack.
But her most powerful work, in my opinion, lives in the theater, where she plays real-life people.
Anybody out here old enough to know Studs Terkel? You know, he was born in 1912, the year the Titanic sank, greatest ship ever built, hits the tip of an iceberg, and bam!
Anna is a pioneer of what's called verbatim theater, where the characters' lines come straight from interviews, transcripts, or recordings. But what does that look like? Basically, Anna interviews real people, selects their most powerful moments, then studies their words, speech patterns, and body language so that she can sort of become them. Most of her work is about some type of American catastrophe, like her 1993 one-person show, Twilight Los Angeles. In it, she interviewed and then embodied more than 20 people whose lives were changed by the 1992 LA riots. Or there's her recent play, This Ghost of Slavery, which weaves slave diaries with interviews of people affected by the carceral system today. But through catastrophe and becoming all the people affected by it, she gets a unique glimpse into who and what our country is. I sat down with Anna in studio to find out what she's learned about America from becoming it. Anna Deavere Smith, welcome to It's Been a Minute.
Thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh, my absolute pleasure. So it's been over 30 years since you debuted Fires in the Mirror, which was a work that you did about Crown Heights riots, 1991. And for those who don't know, it's a one-person play that is a collection of monologues that you derived from interviews that you did with over 100 people in this area. Well, we're in New York City right now, but in the Crown Heights, Brooklyn, New York City area, people from a variety of different backgrounds, with a variety of different means of speaking, people with different views, sometimes vastly or drastically different views on this situation. What made you look at that specific conflict and say, I have to go there and not just collect these stories, but to also become these people? Like, what was behind that urge to tell that story in that way?
Well, Fires in the Mirror was actually the 13th in a series of plays that I wrote called Under the Umbrella On the Road, A Search for American Character. And it started just like that, to try to understand America. My grandfather had said when I was a girl, if you say a word often enough, it becomes you. And I had a classical training and a conservatory theater training, and some things that I learned there about language and identity really fascinated me. And so I decided to really study how the people around me spoke, to see if there was a relationship to their speech and how they spoke to who they were. And really the first one that I made was not a one-person show. I literally would walk up to people in the street of New York, this is in 1980, and say, I know an actor who looks like you. If you give me an hour of your time, I'll invite you to see yourself perform. So that was
what an ask.
That was the first one back in 1980 in a big loft in Tribeca, when Tribeca was basically cheese storage places and button factories and not what it is now. And it was a very exciting experience. You know, I talked to like the lifeguard at the Y. I talked to the great composer Meredith Monk, a hairdresser in a very fancy hair salon, and then found actors to play them, to work on this experiment about language and identity. And so that's really been what my life's work is. You know, I'm lucky that occasionally I get to do television, so most people don't know about this work. They just think of me as, you know, Rainbow's mom on Blackish, or,
right.
you know, the National Security Advisor on the West Wing,
yep.
or, you know, that's how they think of me. But that's really how I've been spending my time. And the whole idea was to use this technique in a way to chase that which is not me. And it was a very counterintuitive thing to do in late 70s, which is when I started thinking about it, because that was the very moment when, if you were not a white heterosexual man,
Right.
then people would say, write about yourself, right? And so
Right.
really that, my generation of people in the late 70s really changed the entire landscape of the American theater by writing about themselves. But I did the opposite. So
Right.
boom. But I'm now in a kind of a transition moment. I mean, to give you an example, I'm going to be doing the Mellon Lectures, which are will be 6 lectures at the National Gallery in Washington. And whereas when I did something called the Jefferson Lecture, which is a sort of fancy lecture in the humanities, it was the title of my lecture was Chasing That Which Is Not Me.
Right.
And for the Mellon Lectures, which I haven't written, but my plan is to write Chasing That Which Is Not Me, Chasing That Which Is Me. So I'm kind of, you're catching me in a moment when I'm adjusting the project, actually. Yeah.
Is that like motivated because now, you've like amassed, I mean, a great volume of work doing this, becoming other people, looking at other people, that now can you look back with a different perspective or see
I think
certain
it's,
patterns of what you may have been looking for with yourself?
Of course, when I write these lectures is when I'll find out why. But the last big play that I did, the last one-person show I did, was a play called Notes from the Field, which is about what we call the school-to-prison pipeline. And you've dealt in your show with the crisis in education, of course. And that really was sparked by someone saying to me, have you ever heard of the school-to-prison pipeline? This is 2011, before this was common parlance.
Right.
And I said, no. And they said, well, you got to come over to my office, and I want you to meet some people. And there were people from all over the country doing this work. The individual invited me was at the Open Society. And someone told a story about a kid in Baltimore, which is where I'm from,
Right.
who peed in a water cooler, and they were going to take him to jail. Well, now I go, well, yeah, that's what they would do. But then the idea of going to jail for something, which is my friend on Nurse Jackie, who's British, said, oh, whatever happened to mischief? Something that could be considered mischief if you were not black or if you were not poor.
Right.
I just thought, oh my God, I have to go home. Not just to Baltimore, but that my mother was a teacher. All of her friends were teachers, is what an educated black woman could do in those days. And I grew up around people who were absolutely committed to making sure nobody left the 6th grade without reading and so forth. I've been teaching for almost 50 years. Next year will be the 50th year, but I've only taught in very, very, privileged environments. And so I think with Notes from the Field and having that sense that I have to pay attention, and, I have to pay attention to a different type of crisis. I think that was sort of the beginning of this project that I'm now thinking about, which is what is the relationship of that which is not me to that which is me.
I'm excited to see what happens what comes to you and what you share with us as you look back.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting. You are a master at becoming others, and you can just as easily play Al Sharpton or a young Jewish man in Brooklyn or a Korean convenience shop owner in Los Angeles. But when you do it, it's not reductive or stereotyping, because you really seeking to get like down to the nitty-gritty details that makes you become somebody else. It feels like you're trying to do them justice. The first time I came across your work, you were embodying Studs Terkel. And I was so amazed. It was fantastic. I had been working on, but right before we started recording, I was telling you I have been working on as an intern this documentary project about Studs Terkel and the Federal Writers Project back in the 1930s. And so I had listened to a lot of archival tape of Studs Terkel, and also had spent a lot of time transcribing contemporary at that time tape of Studs Terkel. So he has a very specific way of talking, and you captured it so accurately and so beautiful. And in past interviews, you said that how someone says something or how they communicate is part of a core of who they are, and that the style of their speech says everything. What did you mean by that? What if the style of someone's way of speaking says everything, what does it say?
Well, I mean, you're putting your finger right on what the project is, right? So which is, and of course it developed a lot over the years, from 1980 when I only played one character, who was Julia, who worked in J.C. Penney, where I was doing temp work. Well, I became interested in how the rhythm of speech could inform an idea of who someone was. First of all, I don't become anybody. People say that. I think of it as trying to make a jump, and you don't make it. I call it the broad jump towards the other. You don't make it, but you're in this other place. A colleague of mine, Richard Schechner at NYU, would talk about that idea of the not. So I'm not. I can't be you. So I'm not you, and I'm not me, but I'm in this other place. I'm in this effort. And, psychologically, let me say, what that is about, I think, is how I've decided to deal with my own sense of non-belongingness, having grown up in a segregated city. And so I've settled for, I say that the tape recorder, and now I can use, first it was cameras got smaller, and now, of course, use your iPhone. The tape recorder creates the necessary distance for me to get close to strangers. And so if you really look at the whole thing I've been doing, it's to get close to my opposites and to get close to strangers as a way of dealing with the sense of estrangement that my generation, I think, of African Americans, and I think even my students now would say, the sense of estrangement from whatever America is. So even as I was searching for America, I'm also trying to solve this other problem. And technically, what I do is listen to speech the way that you might listen to music. So I don't just learn words; I learn utterances, and I understand. I come to become acquainted with what I say is the song someone's singing, and a lot of my work has to do with disaster and catastrophe because I'm a dramatist. So that's exactly when people become very interesting sonically, because they're trying to make sense out of something that makes no sense in order to restore a sense of dignity. So while they're doing that in their speech, and then when I learn it, which, is this very exacting enterprise, I'm coming closer to them becoming themselves, to them trying to restore themselves. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, this is all metaphor. I don't know if this is true. I've never talked to a psychiatrist or anyone about it.
But I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is that when people, in times of catastrophe, taking what you said now and also other things I've heard you say in other interviews, in times of catastrophe, people want to share what's going on. They want to express themselves. They're, as you say, they're shouting to be heard. And in those moments, I think I'm guessing maybe because the urge to be heard pulls ahead of any sort of self-consciousness you may have, you can perhaps come across as more almost like the most you, or a shade of the most you, that you contain, because you're not so much thinking about, well, how do I say this, or who. You're like, no, come here, I've got something to say.
Right. It's very active. It's not rehearsed, right? Like the people who are least, I talk to all kinds of people, right? So, presidents of the United States,
right?
Mayors, police chiefs, they end up being the least useful for what I do, because they speak what I call the haute couture of language, right? So they have training, largely, not to say the wrong thing,
right,
or to find the exact right thing in order to elicit either following or to solve a problem, right? This is not the kind of speech that I'm very good at, right? So I'm interested in the people who are not trying to do that at all. They're really very present in trying to make sense of what just happened to them. And again, to restore not just a kind of sense, but to repair what just happened. And so given the fact that the project was originally an identity project,
right,
then that becomes very, very fascinating to me, how they do it.
Give me an example of a moment where either an interview or either, because you've said that you first are like listening to the story, and then you are, of course, editing and deciding which portion you're going to put where, but then you have to learn the story. Is there a moment from your process where you you can think of a moment where someone slipped from, maybe their more haute couture or rehearsed speech into the moment that you were like, oh, this is the thing that they're trying to tell
Oh, yeah,
me?
that's a really great question. And as Studs would have said, I don't know the answer. When you say it's a good question, it means you don't know the answer, but you really put your finger on what the work is, right? But usually the people who I'm pretty sure I'm going to be using, in the interview, something will happen that I'll think, oh, this has to be in the show, largely because of what it sounds like. And then I'll go and start to find other people who will help build that story out. I mean, maybe one person would be this man who I met in Baltimore, who I interviewed, who actually was the one who took the video. Kevin Moore took the video of Freddie Gray being beaten.
My gosh.
And, I was lucky to get that interview. We were driving down the street, and somebody who was with me who lived in Baltimore, I didn't at the time, said, hey, I think that's the guy who took the video. So we jumped out and we got him, right? But immediately with Kevin, he's speaking the kind of language that's interesting, because he started the story with something like, that he was in bed and somebody came to wake him up and said, man, he starts to perform it right away. Man, they tased him. Woo! So, like, right away, I'm interested.
Right.
Because there's just all these sounds already. Like
Right.
that, woo! I mean, I'm already interested. Like, sure, it's going to be great to get his rendition of the Freddie Gray beating.
Of course.
But it's also that he's speaking already in a musical way, because he's changing his register. He's I know from that minute he's going to change his registers. And then, in the course of time, he did become more emotional, which is also very, because I have to go on stage, and emotions are the juice, right? But I would say, I don't know if that completely answered your question, but
No.
If patterns, if registers change, melodies change, then already I know, oh, this is a person who is going to be designing a very beautiful composition of sounds, and then I'm gonna want to put them on stage.
That's so interesting. Thinking about it's like going to see like a solo saxophone or trumpeter.
That's
It's
right.
like
Yeah, and when I
song after
started
song.
thinking about this a long time ago, I didn't want to get into the nitty gritty of this, but it was really Shakespeare. Learning as a young actress, I was very intimidated by the idea of speaking Shakespeare, and realizing that one of the things that we think of Shakespeare as Shakespeare, but one of the things he did was to create what I called, a kind of jazz on words, and so. In the beginning, before I knew that I'd be doing this interview project, I was very interested in how people would speak in a more jazz-like way, which is, in fact, what we do, unless we're speaking the haute couture of language.
Right.
We are improvising.
You never know what you're going to say till you say
never
it.
know what you're going to say till you
Right.
say it, right?
That's so interesting. Being
And of course, a black artist, that also felt to me like, and having classical training in, a entirely white environment where we played, the plays we were given to work
Right.
on were plays of white males. That as a black artist, finding myself in that environment, just the idea of rather to find a way to assign myself to that tradition, which has been so successful. And I remember reading around that time something of Miles Davis, who also, had a classical training, and then he went to, right. And so that you don't have to throw away, for any young people who are listening to us today, you don't have to throw away the classics, right? That's just one genre, but that there's all of this other stuff you can do. So the notion of American jazz, of course, affected, how I was thinking.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I thinking about also in thinking about the work that you do and how it's related to music. Your ear, I imagine, is very trained to notice things like this the same way that somebody who plays music, especially those who improvise, can almost they can hear an arrangement of sounds in a way that other people just cannot. You've written about, it makes you think about something about your childhood, like you're growing up. You've written about being one of the only Black students in your predominantly white and Jewish junior high school. And this is back in the 60s. This is around a time, and you were of a generation of, Black people who in many ways had a similar experience. They were one of the first people to integrate a school, or they were of the first few classes to integrate a school or a school district. And of that time, you wrote, segregated schools taught you where you did belong. Integrated schools taught in surgical detail where you did not belong. And I imagine that being educated and growing up in that kind of environment, or at least growing up educationally in that kind of environment, would make you very attuned to the subtle differences in the way that people express themselves or carry themselves. And I grew up, at least preschool through 12th grade, in very white educational environments. And in many ways, it made me very attuned to the way that other people talked or spoke or held themselves, or what they were saying without speaking even. And at the time, that was, I think, a stress response probably, or a coping mechanism, but I've found it to be helpful sometimes with my work. And I wonder, how do you think your experience being a part of that early, integration effort, how do you think that influenced your worldview or your work?
That's another really great question. I would say, first of all, that my interest in expression, though, really began in the Black community. Right, because the people around me were incredibly expressive. My Aunt Esther, who is the first person that I ever interviewed with a tape recorder when I was teaching myself how to do this, she was very, very expressive. And, she'd tell a story, of course, and get up on her feet and act it out. And that's all a part of what this is about. And, the Black church, all of that, all of that, the expression of sound wasn't just in music. It's not just in gospel music. It's not just in jazz.
Oh, it's like the call and response. It's
not just a call and response. It's in how we are in the world. So that, Miss Johnson next door, who used to give me a quarter, I didn't get the quarter to keep, but send me down the street to buy her a piece of fat back or ask me to come scratch her back. My gift for that was that I would hear a story. So it's the storytelling that I heard in the Black community was the first thing to develop for me, this interest in expression. And then I think in terms of the outside part, the part about being outside, is how I began, I guess in a laborious way, to develop a worldview, which is about how I don't expect to belong, not even now. So, and I think of belongingness as something that I create for myself. So that, I would say, is what I would say the beginning of the project in that era of us people, nice little girls like me, being told to just go and be strong. I think that was about developing a worldview that is a part of this, chasing that which is not me, and now trying to think about that in relationship to chasing that which is me.
Like,
I mean, you have to solve the problem of living. We still live in a segregated
society. Yes.
Society. In fact, it's more fractured than ever. In some ways, that's a good thing, right? Because people can announce and design identities that, I never thought about when I was a little girl,
Sure.
right? So everybody, no matter how much we seek, my theory is, for belongingness, the fact is that inevitably we're going to be crossing borders. We are going to be. So to have a strategy about how to do that and still feel okay, I think is the strategy.
No, I mean, when you say that makes me think about, I think, how I reflect on a lot of aspects of my upbringing, not feeling like I put words to something that I've been feeling for decades, but not feeling expected, like not feeling like I should expect to belong, has been extremely helpful in so many ways, but also it was like a value that was taught to me when what you just said about, young Black girls like you being told, be strong, don't expect that things are just going to fall in front of your feet.
Right.
It may be what some people might think of as a hard lesson to learn as a young person, but ultimately I think that's how
in
the end works.
You live in, you work, what I've seen since I walked in the front door, you're working in an extraordinarily diverse environment in so many ways. And you're a leader in this environment. And probably the fact that you didn't take for granted your own belongingness means that you can make an environment where lots of people can feel at home and do their best work.
I'm going to take that to my therapist tomorrow. And but you described something that I'm realizing now is a core value of how I think about working and inhabiting this job, and even in creating the show and who we have on and what we talk about. But see, you're so good. I came here to interview you, and here you go. You bring up something. You brought up something that the idea of not belonging. It reminds me of something that you said about unity and the idea of unity. A lot of the work that you've done over the past few decades is about power. It's about racism, identity. Even if it's not explicitly about those things, it's very much still a theme that's in the room. And something that I find so interesting, or that I found very interesting that you said over the years, but I specifically remember it from an interview from 1993, is that you reject the idea of this almost imagined unity that all of these different factions of Americans specifically, we're talking about now, are magically just going to become one unified melting pot, let's say, or tossed salad, I think they tried to make happen in the 90s and 2000s. And that instead you are interested in difference. You are interested in that tension. I wonder, what's an experience from your life, or maybe an early moment where you realized that unity was a false ideal?
I just don't think it's interesting. I mean, I want us to be able to be in peace. I think I want us to be able to be in peace. Mm-hmm. But I don't think the way to go about that is to talk about a melting pot. First of all, it's not in nature. It makes me think about my first trip to Big Sur,
in California.
Mm-hmm. Which is someplace that still inspires me a lot. And there, it's a grain of sand, and I looked closely at the grain of sand, and I saw that it was not brown, but there inside this grain of sand were all these different colors. And so I think it's in nature. Diversity is in nature. That word is now so overused. It's
very corporatized.
It's corporatized, but the particularity is in nature, right? Mm-hmm. So I have a corgi, and my dog is a corgi. And when I got her, the breeder said that, she could be a pet. They're very strict about what dogs can be pets and if you can show them or not. And the reason she would have been a grand champion, except that her ear has an irregularity of whiteness, like a little white speck that keeps her from being a grand champion. And this may go back to Aunt Esther, who actually had vitiligo. And so, to walk with her and go to shopping with her and have people stare at her because of that, in a Black community too,
right,
of that irregularity. Or maybe it's that in my own family where so many different skin colors. Mm-hmm. My brother had blue eyes. My late brother Deavere had blue eyes, was born with platinum blonde hair. And I think that, I guess, and then, we're all different shades. I think I never was trying to make it all one thing, I would say. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It's interesting what you bring up about nature. We wouldn't expect it in nature, and yet
we expect it among us.
Right.
And it's
kind of,
I think we need people to, leadership is about getting a whole lot of people behind one idea, right?
Yeah.
So that we can do something together. Or when I teach, I spend an extraordinary amount of time in the beginning of creating a community right? Where everybody has a different task to do so that people can take risks, right? So we feel better about expressing ourselves and quote unquote being ourselves if we have a sense of a group that works well. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be in unity in that way, but it's work is what I'm saying. We shouldn't just expect it to be
happen.
the case. Yeah.
Right. You know, in the last 30 years, I mean, so much of the work that you've done has focused on sites of conflict and catastrophe, sites where that difference or the struggle that people go through to try to achieve unity or even just try to achieve coexistence, right? You have studied those sites so closely. And I wonder, you know, you said previously that your work is about catastrophe. You've used the word catastrophe a couple times in this conversation already. What is it about catastrophe? Even aside from you being a dramatist, what is it about catastrophe that appeals to you?
Well, I mean, let me just say something about a recent catastrophe that I looked at, which was that Renee Fleming, the opera singer, the great opera singer, asked me to get to know a group of to get to learn something about youth violence in Chicago. And so I spent some time with an extraordinary group founded by Arnie Duncan, the former Secretary of Education under Obama, and Lorraine Powell Jobs, called Chicago Cred. And Arnie Duncan's idea was, well, if we want to get rid of teen gun violence or youth gun violence, things like early childhood are very well and good, but how about if we work with shooters themselves? And so I wrote actually an opera libretto about this group and got to know people who are still living in catastrophe and had lived in catastrophe. Some of them had shot somebody. And I took that work after the opera. The individuals in Chicago Cred said the thing that is the biggest compliment I think any artist can get is like, we do more about us, do more. And so I recently wrote a play for the Atlantic magazine, which is really based in part on the experience of meeting people who themselves have been incarcerated, lived violent lives, and are now in a process of trying to bring other people out of that. So like that's a catastrophe that isn't a world event, and we have plenty of those right in front of us, but it is a catastrophe that's happening in many of our urban areas, and gun violence is a catastrophe right now. So what interested me in particular, I would say, is how people, and it goes back to what I've said earlier in the case of these individuals at Chicago Cred, how people with broken lives strive to make those lives whole. And that through that experience, how they can help others who are broken come to a kind of wholeness. And so, you know, I guess that gets back to the theme of I'm actually more interested in that process of how that which is broken finds a way to reorganize itself than I am by assuming that everything is okay. I mean, I hope I don't sound like Debbie Downer.
No, you don't. I mean, it actually sounds like something that you said about what appeals to you about the way that people talk to you in interviews, which is they are trying to reclaim their dignity after something may have happened or after something disappointed them or harmed them or broke them. Telling your story can be a way of reclaiming your dignity. And you say that sometimes like that urge to reclaim is coming through the urgency in some of the stories that you collect. That seems very related to what you're talking about, like people who are trying to maybe not just reclaim their story, but reclaim their lives, and put them back together.
Reclaim their lives, reclaim their communities, reclaim our history, reclaim a future that has been taken away from us. Right? So this word reclaiming is also a really great way, I think, to think about it.
You know, you've been making work about racism, violence, history, as you just brought up now, for decades. And even I was going back and looking at your book, Talk to Me, from 2000, which you talk a lot about media and politics. But even I noticed that in that work, you brought up some research you were doing in 1997 about Thomas Jefferson's plantation, Monticello, and you also were looking through archive and bringing that into the recent play that you published in the Atlantic magazine. You also had, you had work from, or quotes from people like Frederick Douglass, and also, from slave narratives and diaries that you had collected. You were in the archive while also collecting things contemporarily. And I'm wondering, like, you have been thinking about these themes and also living as a Black woman for a very long time. And you also are still talking about some of them or examining them from a different angle or in a different way. And I wonder, like, in the time that you have been examining racism in the United States, how has the way you've seen it changed? How has your paradigm changed?
Well, I mean, to use the word intersectional is one way. I would use also a word. It's a funny way of thinking about integration, but because we are now at a time that we're very splintered. Like, I get to teach at NYU, right? And my students are all very original, right? And there's something to me that is wonderful about that, because they get to create for themselves an identity that is perhaps unexpected. Then the question is, with all of those different identities together, where do we find a common thread? I mean, that's one thing I would say is there a way, and I don't have an answer for it, is what are the strategies we need to create a common threads now, that we don't have to say, oh, this is all this way, or this is all that way, or this is where you have to be this, and this is where you have to be that. But therefore, I think the project is, if we want to work together, how do we create communities of goodwill? And does that require finding common threads, or are there other strategies? And I don't really know the answers to that, but that's the type of thing I'm thinking about right now. In terms of the work of going into archives, it's really, for me, having written Notes from the Field about the school to prison pipeline, I came out of all of that just thinking about, where did this system come from that we have, the quote unquote system, which isn't just about jail. It's about, sending kids to jail early, as in the school to prison pipeline. It's not just about bad schools. It's not just about poverty. It's not just about drugs. It's not just about guns and violence. It's not just about mental health. It's all of those things, the foster care system. And I came to think the worst thing that can happen to a kid is to be having to make it in the world, either outside of the structure of the family, which we privilege, or outside of the structure of somebody who cares about them. And I thought, where did this system get started? And this is, part of the thing of chasing that which is me. It took me back to Maryland and to Baltimore when I found out about apprenticeships that began in Maryland literally the day after the slaves were emancipated. The people in power took Black children back to the plantations under the guise of being apprentices, where they had to stay until they were 18 if they were girls and 21 if they were boys. And so these histories, I don't need to tell you, these histories really begin to set the stage of how we think about people who are outside of this unity called a family, which is to protect them for whatever reason. If you're plucked out of that, you're really very, very vulnerable. And so it was pretty stunning for me to learn about these apprenticeships and how quickly they came about right after emancipation in the state that I grew up in.
That is stunning. I mean, and it absolutely echoes everything that you see throughout your work. And
everything comes from somewhere.
Everything comes from somewhere.
We don't just pop up at a, we don't just pop up in a catastrophic situation, right? There's something that, a foundation that's a little bit faulty.
It doesn't happen by accident.
Yeah.
You said recently that people are only interested in one perspective nowadays on how we address a lot of the things that you just discussed. And I think that along with that interest, there comes this desire. Sometimes it can be from the marketplace, sometimes it can be from shareholders or the academy, or sometimes media organizations or whatever. But a desire from marginalized groups for one person to lead everyone, for there to be some sort of really unofficial leader of Black people or the LGBTQ community or so on and so forth. And I don't know, that's something that your work completely pushes back on and rejects consistently. I wonder, thinking about what you said about this moment where people are looking for one truth, or one idea about something, I wonder, why is it harder, do you think, for people to hold like multiple truths at once right now?
That's another really good question. On the other hand, what I am seeing though are let's say in the theater. I don't have statistics on this, but it's interesting to me that in the post George Floyd, post the murder of George Floyd, you find like 2 artistic directors, not one, or 2 directors. Now, there are a variety of reasons that could be the case, but I think if the younger people who are working on leadership as a collaboration, if they can work that out, I think that's pretty great. Because I think many of us have lost faith in that idea of that one leader on the one hand, but it shouldn't surprise us on the other hand. When you think about before you were born, all the discussion, say in the 80s, about taking down the quote-unquote patriarchy,
Yes.
So we've been sort of deconstructing this thing over time, and it just happened that when my work, after 13 shows, it took 13 shows to, people who saw my work in the very beginning, were like, oh, Anna, this couldn't happen anywhere. You could never have all these people together anywhere but an airport. Right. And so I had to, really hear all those naysayers all that time. And then at the time that it finally did, become useful, I would say, maybe to some extent, it was because it didn't presume that anybody held the truth. Right. That, in fact, to try to make sense, you had to be able to tolerate more than one point of view. I'm talking about the audience. For the audience to have an experience that would feel rich, they would have to at least entertain different points of view.
Right. Because otherwise, it doesn't feel...
It's like putting together a puzzle. Do you know what I'm saying? And I think that's, when it's, for some reason, we as humans like puzzles. Right?
That's a really beautiful way of putting it, like putting together a puzzle. We do like puzzles. Sometimes I feel like the puzzle that we're in the general sense right now, I don't always know if I like putting it together. Yeah. But it's a necessary project, as you've described it. And what do you think is behind that instinct, I wonder, though, for there to be like a representative? I feel like through your work, talking to so many people and embodying them, it really goes to show just how it really drives home the point that I think many marginalized people and people of color already understand, which is that if you have, I don't know, that each of us are individuals with our own specific experiences and whatnot. But I wonder, what do you think is behind that urge for marginalized groups to have a leader to deliver some sort of message or missive or
protection? I mean, you're very vulnerable when you're outside.
But I wonder, even from let's say, not from within the group, but let's say from outside of it, from power structures, like I said, like perhaps media organizations or government, or like, what do you think people are interested in the optics of representation, of having a representational figure that they feel like they can call upon?
I mean, I'm sure that a sociologist, and I'm not one, I'm an artist, I think and by the way, the fact that I'm an artist would mean that I would be more inclined. It's not unique to me. I mean, I think if you had a painter in here, or if you had Winton here or any other artist, because we compose, we have to decompose. So it's in our nature to take something apart and then put it back together again in another way, right? So even, let's just think about what acting is, right? It's somebody pretending to be somebody else. So it's somebody trying to make a unity out of these two things. So that's what we do. I think it's sort of, it's not unique to me. I think it's a part of what art making is. A sociologist is going to try to understand human behavior, and probably in particular about groups. It makes sense to have somebody who's in charge, right? I mean, you even as I'm talking, when it's time for me to do a project of mine, I'm in charge. And I have to be in charge because I'm expected to deliver, right? So I have to have some kind of an organization. I have to have some kind of a structure that causes people to understand that we're going in one direction. So I'm not talking about chaos. I'm just talking about within that need, having an interesting design that leaves more room for more people to be expressive and creative.
I want to go back for a second to...
let me just quickly say, so segregation is one design. Baltimore, Maryland, where I grew up, going to James Mosher Elementary School, right, with all the other black children in my neighborhood. That's one design, right? And then somebody decided, well, let's try another design. If we looked at the schools in Baltimore right now, we'd say, well, the trying to get another design didn't work, but we at least tried to get another design, right?
Oh, that's such an interesting thought. Segregation is a type of design.
Definitely.
It obviously is, but sometimes segregation or Jim Crow or the structure of racism and how it is kind of codified in our society.
Somebody thought that was a good idea.
A few somebodies.
But we know it's a terrible idea.
It's a terrible idea, but sometimes it can seem so pervasive, like it's like air. It's like you can't escape it, you're breathing it. But it is that, even in and of itself, that feeling, that sensation is a part ultimately of a design that somebody
came up with.
Yeah. But that is almost terrible, though. It's terrible, but it almost makes me hopeful, because if it is in fact a design, like you say, if we as humans are
inclination, it's up to us to design environments where more people can experience joy and kindness and prosperity.
We can actually,
we could think about it.
It's a hell of a project, but we can actually think about it. We can actually think about it. I want to go back for a second to the idea of archive. At this point, obviously, you have worked with your most recent play in the Atlantic about the ghosts of slavery. You have worked with archive for some time, and also now, a lot of your work has become part of the archive. How has your perspective on historical records changed as you now have become, in a way, something of an archivist yourself?
Well, I love those historical records because they're so peculiar. So here's an example.
Okay.
When I was in acting school, I went home one summer to Baltimore. I was in California, in San Francisco. I went home one summer so I could live home for free. And I worked in a club, a men's private club called the Maryland Club, which, talk about a design, they didn't admit women. All these other clubs admitted women, at least by the 90s. The Maryland Club didn't admit women until something like 2000. Check
my
it.
Gosh.
But
and this is like what it was, like a private dining club or one of these things.
Usually they have a lot of athletics. They don't, but this club, they didn't allow women maybe till 5 years ago. So okay. So talk about a design. Of course, no black people. I think they allowed their first black man in the 1980s. But at any rate, I worked there as a cocktail waitress in the 1970s, and in talking to the man, the doorman who had been there forever and ever and ever, I found out, or I was reminded, I had forgotten or didn't put it together, that my grandfather had worked there. My maternal grandfather had worked there in the billiards room. Now, when I'm learning about recently to write this Ghost of Slavery for the Atlantic, which, by the way, is the only second play in 160-some years that they've ever published.
Right.
I find out that after the Civil War, when the slaves were in Baltimore, it had part slave. Maryland was part slave and part free.
Right.
When they didn't know what to do with all of these slaves who were suddenly free, guess what happened to the Maryland Club? A general, Lew Wallace, who had been very pissed off at them because it turned out that they were hiding Confederates, took over the Maryland Club and turned it into a place called Freedmen's Rest that took care of, in particular, women, newly freed slave women and their children. Whoa. And so this place that's a part of my history, and I have to tell you something very funny. I was able to visit there because I belong to a club like that has a great swimming pool in New York, so I was able to visit. So I went in, and when I walked in, first of all, when I worked there in the 70s, no black person really had anything to do with liquor. It was like a German person was the bartender, so forth and so on. And us black people were like the, waiters or whatever, opened the doors. Sure. I walked in, and there was a black woman bartender. And I walked up to the bar, and she said to me, "You looking for somebody?" And there was a black man who came in with a bucket of ice to refresh the ice at the bar. Mm-hmm. And he stood right in front of me, and as if it was like surreptitious, he said, "Are you in town to perform? Are you in something in town?" This is the guy putting the ice in the bar.
Whoa.
But the black woman, for some reason, when I walked in, "You looking for somebody?"
Huh.
So these ways that, that excites me in the way we're talking about my work, then that is a jazz piece right there. Of the assumption of how things should be.
Right.
And the last person I expected to recognize me in that place was the guy shoveling the ice. And the person I had wished had been more courteous to me was the black woman behind the bar.
What a full circle situation.
But it was very exciting to realize that this place where I had worked as cocktail waitress, turns out my paternal grandfather had worked in the billiards room, also held this other extraordinary history in the immediate after, right after the emancipation of black people in Maryland, that actually had become a holding place.
Wow, for free,
against the will for newly freed black women and their children.
Against the will of
this was the very beginning of what we call the Freedmen's Bureau.
Right.
The club was taken over. It was against the will of the people who, were the club members.
They didn't want that, no.
Yeah.
But my gosh, what a history. But it's like, history, it's very easy to think of it as something that just doesn't concern, or it's so far away.
Really?
It doesn't
you think so from where you sit on your show?
Not now. I would say when I was younger, I felt that way, though. I felt like history seemed so, especially too, because, how do I put it? Between my generation, my parents, they grew up watching black and white television, and I didn't. I had color television and cable and the internet. And even just that leap forward in media, it frames the way that you think about the past, because a lot of the things from the past are in black and white. It made them seem much older than, as I've gotten older, I realized that they were. And also, too, as I've gotten older, and I mean, there's a big difference in my age from being, say, 20 to being 36 that I am now. But 16 years is not such a long time. And there are sometimes even ways that I realize that people will talk about, I don't know, say, race in the 90s or in the 2000s. And they'll say, oh, we just didn't know. We didn't know, we didn't know better back then. Like I think about when I learned about, say, Little Rock Nine, right? Or school desegregation when I was in school as a kid. Or Ruby Bridges, who is my parents' age when I was a kid. You would see these pictures in the history books of white people spitting on children or trying to throw things at them or whatever, screaming and shouting. And something that my teachers would say was, this was a long time ago. People didn't know. They didn't know better. They didn't know better back then. And something that I have realized the older that I've gotten is that at least, I mean, I can only speak for my lifetime. There have definitely been some certain occasions where people definitely knew better. And it's made me think a lot differently about history. So much of history, at least
They know
for people
better now.
They know better. They know better now,
When
and sometimes
you
we're still
suffer
doing
an
the same.
insult now, they know the person doing that knows that. They know that now. But don't you feel that in the post-George Floyd era, I mean, the immediate aftermath, I mean, people wanted to know about Juneteenth. I think that this quest to understand history always appears, too, when we're really struggling to change something.
It's true.
We go back.
But sometimes I feel like we go back, and then I feel like maybe perhaps a moment that we're in right now, and then I feel like it can be abandoned when suddenly the demands of the present, when holding the history with the present almost feels a little too close.
But not everybody.
Then I feel
but
like
not
it's
everybody forgets. That's the thing. Not everybody forgets.
Very true. Very true. Very true. You know, you talked about your work as becoming America word by word, or, you know, even if you say you're not necessarily becoming the people that you embody, you certainly, in a way, I mean, I interview people. I'm a journalist. I interview people all the time. And then after, you know, we edit it, we release it, I'm not going to perform later as them. I don't.
Are you sure?
I'm sure. I'm sure. Why do you say that?
Did she put on a show?
Yes. As soon as you leave, I'm going to sit right back here, and then I'm going to do the entire interview from your perspective, and we'll splice it together. But yeah, no, I mean, and many actors, even if they say write their own material, they're not going out having the story hit them for the first time and then going back and trying to work with the recording to construct their performance. Yeah. That's a very unusual situation for an interviewer or an actor to be in general.
Yeah. Oh.
It's very unique work, but in ways you've become America, certainly more so than many others. And you've interviewed hundreds, maybe thousands of people at this point. And you have transformed yourself into many of them, or embodied many of them. I think of it as a very unique vantage point through which to see America that few people inhabit. What do you, or what have you come to understand or know about America that you think other people don't?
You know, honestly, I'm not going to do this, but I would think maybe somebody will, or maybe somebody is. You know, if I were now to go around, and I did travel on the Clinton campaign and the Dole campaign. If I were to travel around, you know, like sort of girl on the bus in the upcoming campaign, that would be a time that I would learn a lot, right? And it's unfortunate I'm not going to do that, but I would say that anybody who is really interested, and I'm sure there are journalists who will, you know, try to suspend some judgment long enough to get close to both sides. I mean, that will be very, very interesting. Of course, there aren't really two sides, but it'll seem like that, you know, in the fall and the months leading up to it. They're not really two sides, but again, back to this thing of how we organize ourselves. I mean, I think this would be a very, very interesting time for that project.
But I'm thinking about you. What is something? I mean, you
so,
paused at that time, but yeah, what do you know?
I think I lived, believe it or not, even though, you know, probably my largest project in terms of recognition was the play about the Los Angeles riots, right? Which was, you know, I did 320 interviews, and I traveled in the all from, you know, from Beverly Hills, from movie stars, you know, Charlton Heston, Angelica Houston, and so forth, you know, to South Central, to what people call Koreatown, traveled with a fantastic journalist, Hector Tobar, in the Latinx community. I mean, it was really vast what I had to do. I still think it was a less even though that was a play about violence,
Mm-hmm.
I think it was about a less violent time than we're in right now. And believe it or not, a less fractured time than we are right now. And since that time, many of us have become, and even in the theater, very afraid to say the wrong thing. And that's a problem for the theater, because the theater should be a transgressive space. I think it's important for us not to be offensive, but I think that there is I think this time is just it's a tougher time to learn the country than when I was really like in the trenches, as I was in Los Angeles. And so I think what I have to say about that in the face of what we're in now would seem almost Pollyanna-ish, if that makes sense, right? Which is, so for example, when the word got out of what I was going to do, that I was in LA doing these interviews, I got a phone call from two students, Korean American graduate students, who said to me, we heard what you're going to do. We heard what you're doing. And we just want you to know that you're going to get it wrong. So we would like to help you.
And those were the students that
they took me around.
Right.
And they translated for me. And people talked to me who would have never talked to me if those two young women were not there. I think, like, who are the ambassadors now? And that's one thing I would say. That's what I would say about America. Like, if it's what have I learned? I have learned that to experience this country, you always have to have a fixer. Like if I go to Rwanda, as I did, or South Africa, as
There's
I have.
Someone
you've
there.
got to find a fixer who has hospitality, who wants to share with you this house that you do not know, and that, by the way, you should not walk in without their company. Like the first time I went to South Africa, great journalist, Charlene Hunter Galt called me up, and she said, do not go, because I went to South Africa the minute, like right after apartheid fell. Minute my show closed, was at a show on Broadway that summer. I went right there, and she called me up and she said, do not go into the townships by yourself. She said, do you hear me? She said, listen to me. You don't know where you're going. Do not go in there alone. And so she helped me find somebody who walked me around the townships. And I think that, let's say when I went to Garrison Junior High School, which was a horrible experience, if I had had a fixer, somebody said, hey, you walk Anna around this school. So it goes back to something we were talking about before about leadership. You really cannot walk alone. You need a fixer. You need a translator to show you around. I don't know, when I grew up, even in the Black community, you go to see somebody, their house, say, come on, let me show you around my way.
Yeah.
Right, my way. I'm going to show you around my way. Right, so it's not just my streets. It's not just a way like a road, but like my way.
My way of getting around.
My way of getting around, my way of being, how I am. And so that's what I've learned. And that has been a very beautiful, beautiful experience for me. Like, I interviewed a rodeo cowboy who is, if you couldn't find anybody less like me than Brent.
Right. Okay.
And for me to be at the rodeo finals in Las Vegas with Brent and his friends, like, I'm not with a bunch of bull riders. What am I doing with a bunch of bull riders? I'm there because of Brent. So I would say that's what I learned about this country, is to find company to be with you in its strangeness. And that is a very whole-making feeling. Because even though you don't belong, you have what the people in Chicago who are working with gun violence taught me about, license to operate, LTO. That you cannot be in the streets if you don't have license to operate. And one of the most wonderful ones, a woman called Siobhan, why did she have license to operate? Because her father had been a king. Right? Like
So
her
he
father
was-
had been a chief. So it's like you have to find that person. And it has to be person has to exude hospitality. But the rules of hospitality are that you have to be a good guest.
I was just going to say you have to be a good guest. And there's
So
a lot
it's
of people
it's
who
about,
don't want to be good guests.
They don't. They don't. But if you show that you're willing to be a good guest, which I think is just about suspending judgment, walking with love, as Pollyanna, find something to love about that individual, they will keep you in their company and show you around. That's really it. I've never thought of it. I have to thank you for that question, especially as I prepare for the Mellon lectures, because that's really it. I've never thought of it till this minute. It's about the company I have found to be with, who I've kept company with. That's what it is.
It's so beautiful the way you describe it as a whole making experience, because that is something that I think, obviously you have a very specific line of work, but I think so many people, even Americans, that I think politicians sometimes in their fictive minds or in the language that they use in their speeches and whatnot, don't imagine that lots of us are connected or close with other people who are different than we are. And it makes me think about so many of the relationships that I have in my life, and how I have been probably host to many people, and I have also been guest to many people as well. And to be a guest is a privilege. And like you said, a very whole-making experience. I have one last question. America is a subject that you have to look at still as at somewhat of a remove, even though you are in it and of it, and you are embodying people and collecting stories of those who are in it and of it. But I wonder if you feel like your feelings about it become engaged through your work. I guess I want to know, after all of the work that you've done and so much of the country and from so many different ways that you've seen, how do you feel about America? Do you believe in it?
What, I'm just coming back after two months in the United Kingdom at Oxford University, where I was a guest and experienced a lot of hospitality. I believe in America. And, it goes back to my roots. It goes back to what I learned about Maryland in order to write This Ghost of Slavery for the Atlantic magazine. It goes back to something that was revealed to me when Henry Louis Gates, also in the PBS world, put me on his show about my roots.
Yes.
And I learned about my on my father's side. The Maryland Club takes me back to my mother's. That's my mother's father. On my father's side of the family, my great uncle was a veterinarian in Gettysburg who got the contract to get the men who buried the dead in Gettysburg.
Wow.
And who was a part of the Underground Railroad. Now, by the way, I've educated parents, fully educated parents. We went to Gettysburg twice a year. To see Aunt Hannah Biggs, and to see Uncle Basil Biggs. And this man's name was Basil Biggs, and nobody told us.
Wow.
Educated people, my friend. Nobody told us. I'm thinking of all the time we spent sitting in Aunt Hannah's living room and going to see Uncle Basil Biggs. Nobody told us about Basil Biggs, who had the contract to bury the dead.
Wow.
And I'm very proud because of that, and I didn't get to go because I was working. All my cousins and my sisters and all, they've made this big journey to Gettysburg. So I'm very pleased about being an American. I am concerned, as we all are, but we've been talking a lot in this conversation about history, and so I've been talking a lot about my particular design to deal with non-belongingness in this country, but I'm very pleased that folks. It means something to me that I am on the land where folks did try to help and make a difference, and that I work hard to learn more and more about it. I feel very pleased to have been invited and welcomed into a Native American community, the Yurok tribe in Northern California, with quite a sense that I don't belong there, but that I have been welcomed there, and hospitality has been extended to me, so that I have been able to learn even more about that crisis and what that was about, and Brian Stevenson, of course, says that we can't think about what happened to Black people without understanding that we're in a post-genocidal society that goes back to that. So I think that I am disappointed in many ways, but I can't not love this country for what I still believe is its potential.
Well, Anna, thank you so much for sharing with me, for coming to talk on this show.
I hope you can make some 15-minute sense.
Oh, no, you were fantastic.
We went in a lot of different directions.
No.
And I didn't know what to expect, so I couldn't prepare.
No, you did great. Everything was great. You've been preparing for the past 40 years with all the work that you've done. This has been really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.